Hi everyone, it's Andrew Marty here from SACS, and today the topic is mission, vision and values. And the question is, are they worth the effort? Is the MVV exercise worth the effort? So just to tell you about the objectives that we're hoping to achieve today, the first thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about what is the MVV undertaking? What is the mission, vision, values undertaking? And we'll be reviewing it to see whether it works. Does it work? Now, I would have to confess, and I will declare up front, for evidence reasons, I'm not much of a supporter of the MVV undertaking because most of the time it doesn't work, and I'll explain why in the fullness of this presentation. I should also say that we kind of put our money where our mouth is in this respect, because over the past 4 years, I've had a number of opportunities to pitch for classic mission, vision, values work with clients, and I turn them down because basically I don't taking money under false pretenses, because I genuinely don't believe it works very well, but there are some alternatives which work very well indeed. Why does it so rarely work? So we'll look at some of the characteristics that MVV exercises have that cause them to not be very effective as a methodology for causing outcomes at work. What are the alternatives to MVV? And I'm going to run you through some very specific alternatives, things that do work. And we are going to start off with a discussion of mission. And in fact, in preparation for this presentation, and by the way, I've just about an hour ago presented this to a group of real live human beings, face-to-face rather than in a webinar context, and really interesting to see the response that you get on this topic. I mean, I guess I wrote a blog post on this going back a few months ago, which got stacks of reads, thousands and thousands of reads, and one of the things that was really interesting is the comments. And I reckon about 70% of the comments said things like, hey, finally someone said it. And then there was about 30% who were horrified. How dare I say such a thing? You know, I think that people love mission, vision, values exercises for a range of reasons. I'll talk about that a little bit further down the track. But before we start, let's look at some example mission statements. So here's some example mission statements from across the internet. TED, its mission statement is spreading ideas. The Humane Society, celebrating animals confronting cruelty. Smithsonian, the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Monterey Bay Aquarium, to inspire conservation of the oceans, etc., etc., etc. So these are classic mission statements. And a mission statement could be called something like a what we stand for statement. Why are we here? What are we here to achieve? Spreading ideas is why TED exists, for instance. So that's a mission statement. Then we have the question of vision. And so here are some example vision statements. So the Human Rights Campaign in the United States of America, its vision statement is equality for everyone. So you can see the idea of a vision statement is often something very aspirational. I mean, realistically, can you genuinely expect that we'll ever have equality for everyone? Yeah, we'll come back to that. Alzheimer's, a world without Alzheimer's. Oxfam, a just world without poverty. So these are vision statements. Now, this really raises an interesting question. I guess whenever I see this sort of thing, I think to myself, well, why do these things exist? Why are we doing them? I'm going to suggest to you that one of the reasons that the whole mission, vision, values exercise is popular is because it makes people feel good. In other words, when human beings see these kinds of words, particularly if they correspond with a person's own worldview, what you get is you get a surge of a thing called dopamine, which is a sort of a satisfaction chemical. Now, dopamine feels good. It's also, by the way, why everybody's hooked on video games. It's also why if you're a blog writer or somebody who posts things on Instagram or on Facebook, why when you get a like, you get this little surge of a feeling of joy. That's dopamine that's causing that. So those we know, and I do not for 1 second dispute that these mission, vision, value statements cause people to feel good. They get this little surge of joy or comfort or satisfaction. So we know that aspect works. So there are some example vision statements. And when you read them, you might say, oh, well, okay, these are pretty good. And in fact, this was a website that was really saying, look at these as good examples because they're nice and brief. And if you look at these, yeah, they certainly pass that test, don't they? They're not very large and complicated and wordy. You might say that they're a little vague, but never mind, we'll continue on. Then values. So what I did on a rainy Sunday afternoon is that I looked on the internet for value statements. Now, for those of you who are watching this in Australia, I have good news for you. Here are your values. The government has determined that your values are respect for the freedom and dignity of the individual, equality of men and women, freedom of religion, etc., etc., etc. But you see the second from the bottom there, a spirit of egalitarianism that embraces mutual respect, tolerance, fair play, compassion for those in need, and pursuit of the public good. And I understand that that was an attempt to capture the Australian value of mateship in sort of non-Australian outbacky type words, if you want to put it that way. A spirit of egalitarianism that embraces mutual respect, tolerance, fair play, compassion for those in need, and pursuit of the public good. Right. So that's our values. We're pleased to hear that. But as well as that, what I did on the same rainy Sunday afternoon is that I looked through the value statements of 40 of Australia's top 200 companies. Why 40? Well, they were the ones that I could find the value statements easily described on the company's website. And it's reassuring to know, if you happen to be an Australian, that 62.5% of the companies in the top 200 stand for integrity. That's great, isn't it? 62.5. 57% stand for performance. That's also good news. Teamwork, 55%. I guess one of the things that's kind of interesting is that you'll see that there's a fair degree of convergence, if you want to put it that way, in the values that big corporations stand for. I mean, if 62% stand for integrity, well, that's way over half, and performance and teamwork. So the majority of organisations in Australia stand for those things. I guess one of the things that I would say, just looking at this from the point of view of a psychologist, one of the things I would say here is that I'm not entirely sure what these things mean. Always being responsible and doing the right thing, that's the middle one for integrity. We will stand by our word. I'm not quite sure what behaviours that looks like. But, okay, let's not pick too much on that. Let's keep going. That's the values of 40 of Australia's top 200 companies. So, as I said before, one of the things that I always think about, well, why are we actually doing this internal? Are we trying to create a better organisation by undertaking this MVV exercise? So, well, that's quite an easy thing to determine, because if it's going to make the organisation a better organisation, well, we have to just define better, and then we have to measure whether that's actually happening. So, for instance, internal issues like staff turnover, do they go down if we have one of these things? If you take engagement into account, engagement being the degree to which people are hooked into their jobs and their colleagues and their organisation, so are people more engaged if you have these things? Do you have higher rates of productivity, profit, all of those sorts of things? If they're working, you would expect that having these things would improve those internal outcomes. What about external considerations? Are we trying to look like a better organisation? So I think that one of the reasons that people have these statements is because it looks good. Put them on a website, everybody says, okay, well, this is nice, these guys are responsible, and these guys are ethical, and all that stuff. Or maybe it's both. Now, some of the things that we're going to talk about today, we do have external evidence for, in the sense of stakeholder satisfaction, but really the question as to whether having one of these things makes you a better organisation from a commercial point of view, that's sort of more in the area of marketing and really kind of isn't my area of expertise. But as to whether it achieves internal outcomes like engagement, staff satisfaction, intention to leave, staff turnover, those kind of things, that I can comment on. So that's question number one. Why are we doing this? Now, the next question then is, do they work? Well, one of the things we know, I've mentioned the dopamine thing, they certainly seem to make people feel good. People like to have these things. They like to read these nice words in the way that if you read a nice poem or hear nice lyrics in a song, it feels good. One of the things I would say is that I find very often that MVV is very popular in amongst top-down senior executives. A chief executive, for instance, who is very keen on control will often believe in and like MVV because they believe that what they're doing is that they're cascading something down into the organisation, which makes it more effective to control the culture of that organisation. Culture being behaviours, performance, those kind of things. We also know that some research in the past has said they do work. And so there was a big paper published in 2001 by a guy called Bart and some colleagues, and that says they do work. Maybe with some proviso. I mean, he did say, well, they work provided A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and he had some research evidence for that. There are some questions about methodology, but let's not quibble too much. Bart et al. Says, yes, they do. And then others say that they don't, at least not enough to justify the effort. And for instance, more recently, in 2011 rather, De Schmidt and colleagues published what's known as a meta-analysis of research into mission, vision, values, which is to say that a meta-analysis is a study where you take many previously developed pieces of research, you combine the stats, and you try to pull an overall effect out. Do they work? And what he said is, well, yeah, they kind of slightly work, but there's a lot of effort in creating these things, and is this really good enough to merit doing this? By the way, I don't think that there is. Boswell, on the other hand, knows that this indicates that there seems to be no doubt that clarity of purpose matters, and Boswell's conducted a lot of research into what's called line of sight in strategy. And if you have a line of sight about how your job plugs into the strategy of your team, and the team plugs into the strategy of the division, that seems to help. There doesn't seem to be any question that clarity of purpose helps. And also there's a stack of research about how clarity of purpose helps engagement, so that bit's really not up for contention. Now, the final statement here, I find it surprising that MVVs are found so weakly to correlate with performance. Because, all right, you're going to create an MVV statement. My question is, wouldn't organisations that care about this be the sorts of organisations that might have better outcomes, largely because they actually care about people stuff? They have a better climate. So, you know, the question is whether there's, in science we call this correlation versus causation. In other words, if you've got an MVV statement and your organisational performance is better, is it the MVV statement that's causing that, or is the MVV statement a product of a kind of a positive corporate culture that also causes performance to be better? Anyway, the point is, I find it surprising that they are so weakly related with performance. What it may say is that maybe people do this for a range of different reasons. In the workshop that I ran this morning, somebody was saying that he knows that some chief executives who actually undertake MVVs as a kind of a method of social control rather than as a method of social enhancement. So maybe that's part of it as well. So I think on balance, they don't work. And certainly everybody agrees that there's a fair slice of the time when they don't work. So why don't they work? All right, here is a diagram which I think sums up why these things work so rarely. And this is a piece of information from the world of engagement research. And you see we mentioned Cotton and Hart there. Peter Cotton and Peter Hart are involved in measurement of engagement in different organisations. Firstly, let me just slow down for a moment and say what I mean by engagement. Engagement, as it's defined these days, really has three characteristics. To sum up what engagement is overall, it's a sort of a positive and energetic mental state that people bring to their work, and it causes them to perform better. The evidence for engagement being a good thing in organisations is irrefutable. When organisations have high levels of engagement, they're more profitable, they have less bad stuff going on, and they certainly seem to do better from a customer stakeholder satisfaction point of view. So the engagement of individuals has three components. The first is a thing called vigour or energy. So people who are highly engaged are energetic. The second is a thing called commitment or dedication. And what that means is that people are actually taking their work seriously. And the third is a thing called absorption. And that is to say that when employees are highly engaged, they're sort of drawn into their work. They're happily engrossed in their work, as a guy called Bakker wrote in 2011, I think it was, to describe this idea, this phenomenon of engagement. So engagement is vigor or energy, dedication or commitment, and you could call it flow or absorption, and that's where people get drawn into their work and their team. And time flies, and they're doing great work, and they're happy doing it, and they don't think too much about time outside of work. So it's a positive situation. And I guess one of the questions I'd ask you is that if you could imagine coming to work and all of your employees were vigorous dedicated and getting happily engrossed in their work, what do you think your results would be like? Well, if you've said, well, I think they'd be pretty good, you've answered what the research has discovered, which is that levels of engagement going up increase levels of productivity and satisfaction in organisations, and you get less bad things, and vice versa. When it goes down, you get more bad things and you get less good things. So engagement matters. But what causes engagement? Well, employees live in 4 worlds. They live in the world of their job. So you can imagine, if I'm doing a job which I enjoy, my probability of being engaged is much higher than if I'm doing a job that I hate or I don't value. They live in the world of their team, which is to say, I'm immersed in a group of people, and if my team is positive, helpful, optimistic, friendly, versus cynical, political, ugly, racked with strife, obviously, if I'm in a good team, I'm going to be in a much better psychological state and more highly engaged. And my leader has a big impact on engagement. And in a study that we undertook with Deakin University in 2008, 17, 16, I think it was, what we discovered is that the leader, in fact, sets the tone for the team and the job. In other words, good leadership makes the team more effective and more cohesive and more supportive. And it also makes the job more interesting, more varied, more meaningful. So the leader is a real key. But what Cotton and Hart discovered, and they're not the only ones, they discovered that 80% of my well-being comes from the immediate team that I belong to. So the catchphrase for this is culture is local. And I sometimes tell clients the idea of corporate culture is almost a myth. It's not quite a myth, because in some organizations you will have characteristics that are virtually across every team. So it's not a myth, but it's almost a myth, because if you measure engagement in organizations, you get much bigger differences between teams in the one organization than you do between whole organizations. And the bigger an organization gets, the more likely it is that their overall level of engagement is going to be pretty close to the 50th percentile population average. Very hard to have an organization of 40,000 people, for instance, that's at the 60th percentile for engagement. It's a thing called regression to the mean, but ultimately differences between teams in the one organization are much more important than, or much more significant than, differences between whole organizations. Why am I telling you all of this? I'm telling you all of this because what this means is that if you're in a good team in a bad organization, you're in heaven. If you're in a bad team in a good organization, you're in hell. Now, the effect that we're talking here, this is Psychology 101, is the difference between proximal and distal. Proximal means things that are close to me. So if I am sitting beside my trusted colleague, Mary Smith, who I have worked with for the last 4 years, and she says X, but I find out that the chief executive has said Y, most people are going to believe Mary Smith, because Mary Smith is proximal and the chief executive is distal. Now, the organization contributes only 20% of my well-being. 80% of my well-being comes from, if I'm in a team of 5 people in an organization of 1,000 or 2,000 or 20,000, 80% of my well-being is going to come from those 5 people and their interactions rather than the organization. So in psychology, proximal works, things that are close to me work, things that are distal from me don't work. And this is one of the big problems with mission, vision, value statements. They are often, in fact, virtually always distal. So they can be distal from me. They're invented by somebody else. But even if I was part of the process, but if the statement is organizational rather than linked to my immediate work or my immediate work group, then it's distal from me. It can be distal in time. When was this thing invented? I don't know anything about this. It's distal. And that's why many employees, particularly lower level organizational employees, they simply don't understand, they don't care, they don't know about what these MVV statements mean. The other thing about it is that quite often mission, vision, value statements are worded in words that people who are in the lower levels of the organization or away from the executive team, they're not the words they use. Now, language is of its very nature distancing, and it also creates proximity. If I'm using the same language as people who are around me, that's a proximal effect. That's why gangs always have their own words. They invent their own terminology, because that terminology says, hey, all of my friends are proximal, and all you other people who are not part of the gang, you're distal. That's also why people dress a certain way or whatever. So MVVs are distal. Even if you've been involved in creating the thing, if it's an organisational thing, it's not likely to be proximal. If it's worded in a way that you don't relate to personally, then that will also make it distal. So there are a couple of reasons why MVVs don't work. But let's talk about the wording more. Make-A-Wish Foundation. The wording here is that that people everywhere will share the power of a wish. Habitat for Humanity, a world where everyone has a decent place to live. Really? I mean, I actually am not sure what that means. That everyone will share the power of a wish? I mean, that's really bad. You will get the dopamine effect there because a lot of people will say, oh, well, that's lovely and it feels great. But the problem with dopamine effects is that they tend to be rather short-lived, and they certainly tend not to always change behaviour. So MVVs often fail because they're vague and unclear. Wording is often code or corporate speak, which makes it distal from many employees. And one of the things that we have to understand is that clarity of purpose means clarity of words. It also means brevity, by the way. You cannot have clarity from long, complex statements or things that have a lot of different aspects to it. Clarity is something that has to be worded simply, and it has to be worded briefly. So let's talk about the alternatives to mission and vision firstly. We're going to get onto values in just a little while, but we'll talk about mission and vision. And so one of the things that we've done with many organisations is that we help them to create outcome statements. Outcomes is a really good alternative to mission and vision. You can create clarity through outcomes. And so instead of vague mission and vision statements, create outcome statements. What is this organisation here to deliver? What outcomes is the organisation here to deliver? Just on that score, we help many organisations to build workforce plans. And it's amazing when you go to undertake a workforce planning exercise for an organisation, I'll start off with strategy, because I'll say to whoever we're working with, typically an executive group or the chief executive, well, you want a workforce plan, but for what? You see, a workforce plan has to be built to achieve certain outcomes. So if the strategy is growth, well, let's define what you mean by growth. I mean, do you mean geographical growth? Do you mean commercial growth? If it's profit, all right, well, let's define what sort of profit you want. If it's customer satisfaction, all right, well, let's define who these customers are and what satisfaction is and how it's going to be measured. So an outcome statement should be specific, measurable, aligned, so aligned with your strategic purpose, of course, realistic, so that it's something that can be achieved. And by the way, going back to some of those vision statements, everybody being equal everywhere, well, I'm not sure that's realistic. I mean, personally, I would struggle to feel motivated by that because to me it seems intrinsically unachievable. And finally, it should be trackable, which is to say, if you're halfway through a year, you should know whether you're halfway through towards the target. Now, the reason that outcome statements work is because they are, in effect, goals. And goals are really powerful motivators and clarifiers. And there's a lot of research that's been undertaken on this. Two guys by the name of Locke and Latham are very famous goal theorists, and they've undertaken many, many studies on the effectiveness of goals. Now, one of the things that's really important about this is that it's great to have goals, and we know that, in fact, you can have too many goals. Let me put it this way. If I were to agree with you, there is one goal that you need to achieve, and you think that goal sounds achievable, and actually I care about that goal, I reckon there's every chance you'd achieve that goal. If I said I need you to achieve, let's say, 300 goals, and you went through and studiously looked at each one of those 300 goals, and you identified that each one of them seemed to be achievable, and actually they looked all right, would you achieve the 300 goals? Well, most people don't. So Locke and Latham started to raise the question, I wonder how many goals people can pursue. And so they started off doing goal research where they got people to look at 1 goal, 2 goals, 3 goals. And what they discovered is up to about 4 goals and even 5 goals, most people acted as though they had these goals. These goals mattered. They would try to pursue these goals. Once you got to 6 goals, a certain slice of the population acted as though there were no goals whatsoever. And then so on from 7, 8, 9. And beyond 9, most people did not pursue any goals or acted as though they didn't have any goals because of a thing called goal diffusion. You get too many goals, the goals simply stop being effective. So I'm going to suggest that clarity for anything, for a job, for a team, for an organization, is a maximum of 7 goals. Ideally less than that, maybe 5 is good. Now you can wrap it up with a nice, warm, vague statement if you want, but outcome statements framed as goals can be shown to create clarity and alignment. How do we know this? Well, we have done this for many organizations, and we've measured role clarity before, during, and after such an exercise, and it takes a huge leap when you do it this way. It can also be shown to affect behaviors. So here's a diagram that we call cascading of strategic intent. It's amazing actually how few organizations have a statement of outcomes. What is this organization here to achieve? So I think of my own organization, SACS, and we've been through this exercise, and we think we're here to achieve customer satisfaction, and we've got ways of measuring that. We think we're here to achieve certain qualities of work, and we've got ways of measuring that. We believe that we're here to achieve internal outcomes like happy staff and degrees of cohesion in amongst that stuff, so we can measure that. And we're here to achieve a certain amount of profit. So we're not a not-for-profit, or let me put it this way, we certainly don't intend to be a not-for-profit. So those goals are something that everybody knows, and everybody makes it really clear what the organization's about. When we make a decision, everybody gets why we're making a decision, and sometimes we cast the decision in the light of those small handful of things. By the way, that's also how we define the jobs of individuals. If consulting staff in SACS, their job really is, or success is defined as 4 things. Happy colleagues with a measure, happy clients with a measure, happy quality of work needs to be of a certain standard, and that is based on rating of whoever the leader is. And then finally, they need to achieve certain commercial outcomes. So for an employee of SACS, there are 4 things that adds up to the job definition. By the way, task-based job definitions don't seem to have huge clarity either, largely because they're usually got a lot of tasks. And the big question is not so much what am I supposed to do, but what am I actually supposed to achieve in terms of outcomes? All right, let's go back to the organizational level. So an organization has 5 to 7 clear outcomes. There might be more measures than 5 to 7, that's acceptable, but let's say there are 5 to 7 clear outcomes. If you've got those 5 to 7 clear outcomes, they cascade down into the divisions. So 5 to 7 clear outcomes for each division. Okay, then down to the work groups, 5 to 7 clear outcomes for each of the work groups. And finally, for the employees. So we run an exercise, an OD type exercises that we call real world outcomes, where we lead a facilitated process where these things get built. Now, on a number of occasions now, we've measured role clarity with people before, during, and after this exercise. I remember in one exercise, we had a client that was at about 12th percentile for role clarity across the organization. And about 6 months later, after going through this exercise, they were at about the 70th percentile from memory, somewhere like 65, 70. So that was a big improvement. And also they got improvements in productivity. So this is a way, outcomes is a way of creating clarity. Plus, you know, if the outcomes are meaningful in terms of people's personal perspectives, they can also be motivational because they go away from this vague, a world without poverty or world peace or whatever kind of orientation to something that I actually can personally relate to. I can see how we're going to pursue that. And it also, as I mentioned earlier, has the additional benefit of causing people to understand why certain actions are taken. So I'm going to give you a real world example. I'm doing a project with an organisation called the State Library of Victoria right now. And in this project, we're doing a bunch of things associated with workforce planning. And one of the things that we're doing is that we're helping them to restructure. So this is the product of the executive team of the State Library of Victoria. Now, we got them to create a destination statement, and the destination statement, in effect, you could call that kind of like a vision statement. They're saying, what do we want this place to be like in terms of our interactions, us as a group of people? And you'll see that this is kind of vague and fluffy. So I'm not entirely an enemy of vague and fluffy, but it certainly needs to be backed up by something a little bit more specific. So ambitious, courageous, happy visitors, flexible, agile, enduring and sustainable. And the executive team came up with this, and they cared deeply about it. I reckon it's a great statement. It certainly defines where they want to get to. And it also, you can measure how close you are to this. There's a technique that we use to help people to measure how close they are. So you can actually measure your progress towards this ideal state. But over the next page, what we have is their outcome statements. So you can see that here are some specific outcomes that the State Library of Victoria has committed to. Satisfied and engaged visitors, relevant and accessible collections being all of the material that is kept within the State Library collection, diverse and engaged employees, sustainable operations, so revenues and partnerships and balances of risks and budgets and those sorts of things, premier cultural, educational and tourist destination. So those are headings, and you'll see here are quantitatively available measures of these various components. And you see these where it says KPI, this means where a KPI has already been put in place. And what these gaps mean is that KPIs need to be put in place in order to ensure that the whole outcome statement is complete. Now, let me tell you, as we're building a workforce plan for this organisation, this is incredibly helpful for us to understand what the organisation is actually about. And I think it's very clarifying for internal employees. And in addition to that, you have the ability to base decisions on this. Now, one of the things that we understand about this, I'm just going to skip back a couple of slides. So there's also one of these, not just at the organisational level, there's one at the sort of division level. They don't actually call them that at SLV, but never mind. For most purposes, you'd call them divisions, and then work groups, and then employees. So it's a cascading of clarity. So what it means is that the next level down, that sort of divisional level, is aligned with the organisational level. The work group level is aligned with the divisional level. And in effect, what you end up with is clarity. Now, outcome statements make excellent job definitions. I think you can define any job with up to 7 of these outcome statements, and usually less. 4 to 7 is what we would aim for. When there, as I said, there were 4 at SACS. One of the things that we find, though, is that you get job descriptions which are descriptions of tasks that need to be undertaken, but very little description of what needs to be achieved. I think you should do it the other way around. In other words, if you're committed to your current task-based job definitions, that's great, but why not build outcome statements over the top of them so people can be really clear about what needs to be achieved? The other thing I'd say about this is that if you've got outcome statements for jobs, it allows people to use their creativity to achieve those outcomes. If, on the other hand, what you have is a list of tasks that need to be undertaken, that will tend to sponsor a climate of obedience, the opposite of innovation, I guess you could say. It's a okay, I got to do these things sort of a mentality rather than I have to achieve these outcomes. So, in short, I am a fan of outcome statements, and I've seen them make very significant differences to internal levels of engagement, and they tend not to be vague. They tend to be quite specific. But what about value statements? I think that there's a very clear alternative to value statements, self-generated behaviour protocols. And let me explain what I mean by a self-generated behavioural protocol. A lot of value statements tend to suffer from what I call the distal and vague disease: integrity, performance, teamwork, respect. I mean, you imagine if you had the misfortune of working for me, if I went up to you and said, look, I need you to demonstrate more integrity. Would you really know what I meant? I need you to demonstrate more respect. Would you really know what I meant? I don't think you do. I think that there are behaviours that are related to integrity. And what we have to do is specify the behaviours. Otherwise, it's vague. The other question I think is really important is integrity in an accountant the same as integrity in a sales rep? Are the behaviours the same? Well, I think emphatically not. All you have to do is hang around with a bunch of accountants and then hang around with a bunch of sales reps. And the ethical and high quality sales reps, their integrity is different from the integrity of an accountant. The behaviours are actually different. So we suggest forget value statements and instead have behaviour statements. And the next bit is the one where a lot of people see this whole idea as heresy: culture's local. Remember, good team in a bad organisation, heaven, bad team in a good organisation, hell. Forget insisting that these things are done organisationally. You need to have local behaviour statements. And so our process is to facilitate each team to create their own behaviour statements so that it's of its very nature proximal. Okay, a behaviour statement. Now, a lot of controlling chief executives hate this idea that every team's going to have their own behaviour statement. By the way, you can also, once you've created all of these individual behaviour statements across the organisation, what I like to do is that if you want an overall statement, there are two ways of doing it. One is that you can get a representative group of employees to create an organisational one, or you can simply aggregate everything that's been found in all of the individual behaviour statements and come up with a unifying behaviour statement for the organisation, in effect distilled from all of those individual group statements. So here's a process. Now, this process is a process that you could call it a team building exercise. By the way, team building exercises work when they're related to work. Sending people away to go to the masseurs or go whitewater rafting, yeah, do that if you want. But research suggests that it doesn't have much effect on your corporate culture at work because it's work stuff that determines the culture at work. And yeah, people might like each other a little bit more, or they might relate to each other a little bit more. Doing stuff at work can change culture really quickly. Doing stuff associated with, I don't know, problem solving in the jungle or walking the Kokoda track, I mean, that could be nice, but it really doesn't change work behaviours that much. So here's how you create a self-generated behaviour protocol. I'm going to suggest get the entire team in a room. Now, when I say the entire team, if you've got a team of 30 or 40 people, 40, 50, 60, I've done it with 400. That's my record so far. At the State Library, we're working with a mere 137, I think it is. But get the entire team in a room. If you can't get the entire team in a room, get as big a group, as representative a group as you possibly can in the room at one time. If you're going to do this for an entire organisation, you may need a subset. Golden rule number one, never use volunteers. Volunteers are of their very nature unrepresentative of their colleagues. We never use volunteers for this kind of an exercise. What you would be well advised to do is to run a nomination process where colleagues nominate the people who they want to be involved in this exercise. And so, yeah, I mean, you'll end up with a large group of people. People sometimes think it's a good idea to do this with small groups. Never. Why have the army against you when you can have the army with you? So, yeah, I mean, when I've done organisational restructure, as I said, for SLV, 130, 140 people, worked with, as I said, up to 400 people at times. Those people go out to the rest of the organisation and engage their colleagues, and they make sure that whatever's going on in the room is part of the culture of the rest of the organisation. So, but to work with a group, I don't know, let's say between 5 and 50 people, or maybe 100 people, if possible, get everyone in a room. Ask them to write down 5 words or phrases which describe the best possible version of the work team, the one that they'd be proudest to belong to. Ask everybody to discuss what they wrote with a colleague. Get everybody to announce, in other words, to voice out to the rest of the room. And I quite often like them to voice out not their own words or phrases, but their colleagues' words or phrases. And this is a fantastic way of making sure that shy people get heard. Don't talk about your own words or phrases. Hang on to the book where your colleague has written down their words or phrases and speak their words or phrases. Write them down on a whiteboard. Distill up to 7 themes from the words and phrases, and that's the destination statement that you saw before for State Library of Victoria. Distill up to 7 themes from the words and phrases. Get a reality check out of 10. This is a really useful thing to do. It's actually quite accurate psychological measurement, where you get people to say, how close are we to this ideal that we've all come up with? We've got 7 themes. What's the reality check? How close are we to this ideal? So get people to write down a number between 0 and 10. 0 means as bad as possible. 10 means absolutely perfect. Nothing needs to change. They all write them down and just ask how many 10s, how many 9s, how many 8s. You'll get a number which tells you how close the group is to ideal. By the way, if you do this for this kind of an exercise, functional and effective teams in Australia get an average score of about 7+. So if you're considerably below that 7, then you know that you've got some work to do. But what's also worthwhile, set a target. How do we want the rate? What do we want the rating to be in 1 year? So quantifying. So let's say we're a 4 right now and we want to be an 8 in a year. Well, anybody who sits there and says, okay, well, we're 4 and we want to be an 8, I'll ask people, well, what does this suggest? In general, people will say, okay, we got a lot of work to do. Once you've done this, so you can see that there's a destination setting exercise, and there's an example of that from SLV in this document, as I showed you before. Once you've got the destination defined, split the group into smaller groups, 3 to 10, depending on how many people you have. Small group activities in this kind of exercise are brilliant because people who are shy will talk. And then what you do is you get them to write down behaviours that they think will get them to the ideal. Get them to write them down on flip charts. So what do I mean by behaviours? I do not mean things like integrity. I do not mean things like collegiality. I mean things like we turn up to our meetings on time. I mean things like if I have a decision to make that affects a colleague, I will talk about it with that colleague. You know, observable behaviours. That's what works. Then once they've all written all of their behaviours down on their flip charts, stick them up on a wall and ask people to vote for the ones that they care most about. Encourage them to vote for behaviours which are really clear and observable, not code. People will tend to write code, by the way, in this exercise. But if the participants have been briefed to vote for things that are really clear to them, they'll do that. I often use a 3-2-1 voting process. I didn't when I had 400 people. I just use a 1. But if you've got, I don't know, a group of 10 or 15 or 20 or something like that, 3-2-1 is a way of doing it. So they vote 3 votes to the single behaviour which they care most about, 2 votes for the one that's the second most important, 1 vote for the third most important. And you'll find that when you put all these flip charts up on the wall, the same behaviour might appear on more than one sheet. That's fine. People vote wherever they like, and then later on you'll just consolidate them. And in fact, normally when I consolidate it, I do it in front of people. The more people can actually see all of this happening, the more that they feel trust in the process. 3-2-1 voting process. Add up the votes. And let me tell you, when you do this, and I've done it many, many times, you'll end up with between 8 and 12 core behaviours in most cases, and they will get significant amounts of votes. And you'll see that there will be sort of a cut line. Okay, so we get in 30 votes, 28 votes, 27 votes, 21 votes, 22 votes, and then it'll drop away to 4 or something. Basically, anything above that cut line, you might make into a core behaviour. And so once you've got the behaviour statement developed, then what's really crucial is you have to decide how you're going to keep that alive. So you can use it for recruitment. You can say, hey, here are the behaviours that we've committed to in our team. Performance development. So you can use it for, here are the behaviours that we need from you, and that's different from what we're getting at the moment. What we sometimes do is that we take these behaviours and we convert it into a 360-degree feedback instrument. We've done that for many organisations. And what that means is that those behaviours then become something that can be measured. If you want to keep the behaviours live, let me tell you, that's a way of doing it. If people know that they're going to be measured, say, 6 monthly or annually on those behaviours, they're likely to pay attention to them. Succession planning. So you might have different behaviours in a leadership group from the behaviours that you have in the group of people that they're leading. We've often created behaviour statements from groups of leaders. Or we might do something like have a behaviour of the month. If we've got, I don't know, 8 behaviours that got votes, why don't we say, okay, the behaviour of the month for this month is behaviour number 1. Next month, behaviour number 2, and so on. And you rotate them as people go through, as we go through month by month. So behaviour statements. Now, these have an enormous effect on good and bad behaviours. So they're very clear and they're very proximal. So, you know, how can you say I'm going to ignore this statement? I mean, you were part of the creation of it, and it's for us as a team. Also, it's worded in our words. It's not worded in corporate speak. The worst thing you can do, just by the by, is to take this and give them to the communications team to polish up. You need them to be worded in the words of the people who are doing this stuff. I've worked with depots in local government, for instance. You create behaviour statements in their words, they work. The moment that it looks like something from head office, forget it. It can be something that they created, but if you fiddle with the wording, you're going to make it distil very quickly. Now, when people create these things, and Peter Cotton, who I mentioned earlier, and who has in the past advised Cabinet on workplace engagement related matters, Peter will say that there's extremely strong research evidence that this minimises bad behaviours and maximises good behaviours. So it's powerful in a way that MVV will never do. This local behaviour statement approach works. It will change behaviours. So then that really raises the question about values. I mean, am I saying that values don't matter? Well, in fact, I am going to say that values matter, but the values that we know from science are different from the values that exist in company value statements. So values actually exist at different levels, and two key levels. Values exist at the individual level, and they also exist at the collective level: organisation, city, state, nation. Now, the definition of values as it stands right now, Sir Gibbs, Schwartz and Ariely, 2011, desirable transsituational goals that serve as guiding principles in people's lives. Now, I mentioned code before. Yeah, that's code. That's what you'd call psychology research code. Let me tell you what it means. Values are goals. That's the key first point. A value, as it's defined in science, is a goal that I will pursue. The transsituational bit means that for something to truly be a value, it has to apply at work, it has to apply in my family, it has to apply down the footy club, it has to apply in the pub on Friday night when I'm listening to the acoustic music show. Values apply across a range of different situations. But values also guide my action. And that's why they can be important. So personal and collective values tend to interact with each other. Now, this is Shalom Schwartz. I mentioned him before in that reference. Schwartz is one of the world's leading researchers in values. And I guess one of the things, anybody who's ever been involved in research, Schwartz is measuring more than 500,000 people a year due to his involvement in a thing called the European Social Survey. Anybody who measures more than 500,000 people a year, that's serious science. The other thing is that Schwartz, in developing his tools, has measured literally millions of people, so much so that he measured the values of the world, and these are the 7 kind of cultural values that he was able to identify from his research. I won't go into the technicalities of how he did it, but he did it with big science. And basically what he discovered is that he was able to map the world in terms of values. And so here are the 7 values that he discovered at the cultural level. First is embeddedness. Embeddedness means I have to fit in. It's not a good thing in this society to stick out, to be a radical. And closely aligned to embeddedness, and the reason that they're side by side, is hierarchy. I am embedded in society, but hierarchy says I should obey people who are in positions of authority. So they might be people who are in positions of authority for social reasons or for religious reasons or for government reasons or for whatever. And what he discovered is that when he measured millions of people across the world, he was able to identify that people from Muslim, Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa seemed to fit more commonly into this embeddedness and hierarchy kind of perspective on life. Also, South and Southeast Asia was like that. Not as strongly as Muslim, Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, but similar. Then hierarchy and mastery. Mastery is about a sort of a sense of ambition and getting stuff done and striking out and taking risks. The Confucians, so that's sort of middle China, if you want to put it that way, were respectful of hierarchy and mastery. In other words, it's a good thing to go and do stuff, to be active, to be ambitious. By the way, if you ever read Confucius, that's very much the theme that comes out of his work. Affective autonomy is all about, I have a right to have fun. I have a right to do what I want to do, to feel good about myself. So the English-speaking world, we're not so into embeddedness. It's quite all right for us to look different, to present ourselves differently, and we're going to have fun. And not only that, we're going to be ambitious and try to strike out. Intellectual autonomy and egalitarianism, Western Europe. Intellectual autonomy, I have a right to think freely. I can think however I like. Egalitarianism, we're all equal. And if you go to places like Holland or Scandinavia, you certainly see that intellectual autonomy and an egalitarian perspective. And East, Central and Baltic Europe, somewhere between harmony and embeddedness. And the Latins right in the middle, swinging in whatever direction they want, I guess. But that's interesting, isn't it? You can map the world in terms of values. But there are also individual values. And there are 10 of those. And the 10 are, of course, affected by these 7 cultural values. So if I grow up in Western Europe, you have to expect that my personal value set is going to be different from if I grew up in, I don't know, New York, let's say. So, and we see that. Schwartz has been able to demonstrate that you get differences in individual values. I'm going to show you an example. So do values matter? Well, in fact, yes, they do. And what we have here is a sample of, I think it was about 1,500 people from the not-for-profit sector. Now, if you measure all of these people and they're exactly average in terms of values, and we have normed this instrument for Australia, you would expect that they would be all along this 50 line because that's population average. But you know what? They're not. Look at this. So this is the values of the aged care sector. This is the values of the disability sector. This is the values of the general not-for-profit sector. And what we mean by general not-for-profit is we mean not-for-profits that are not in aged or disability care. So they might be peak bodies. They might be organisations that are associated with sporting, or they could be to do with some industry sector or something like that. In other words, they're not disability or not-for-profit. So what do you notice? Well, the first thing I notice is how incredibly closely correlated they are. So there seems to be a kind of a not-for-profit-ish value set. So, all quite low in power, which means I don't want to dominate people. All relatively low in achievement, which is interesting because what that means is it's not a very ambitious, driven, progress-orientated sort of sector. About average in hedonism, down to a little below average in hedonism. Hedonism is about having fun or enjoyment. Stimulation. This is concerning a lot of people in the not-for-profit sector right now, because the sector is going through enormous change. But stimulation is the desire, the belief that it's important to get variety and the preparedness to take a risk. So that's not really very change-orientated, is it? But look at the score for self-direction. What that says is you have an entire sector, and this sample was big enough to be regarded as normative, in other words, big enough to be regarded as representative of the industry generally, not very keen on self-direction. Now, they are very high on universalism, and you'll understand why when I explain it. Universalism is, I want to make the world a better place. So it's a sort of an orientation to social justice or environmental sustainability or both. Universalism is, let's improve things in the world. Benevolence, yeah, a little above average in benevolence. That's how I want to help the person who's in front of me right now. Tradition is all about, I want to follow the dictates of my forefathers or my religion or my society. Conformity. Conformity is, I will obey the rules. And security is, everybody has to be safe. So this paints the picture, low self-direction, low stimulation, says, I'm not that keen on change, and really I'll rather do what I'm asked to do rather than strike out and make plans. And I'm also very concerned about safety and security, and I really would like to follow the rules if I possibly can. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because the whole not-for-profit sector has been thrown into a contestable kind of an environment through self-directed care and through the idea of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, where now companies that are in this sector have to compete with each other. Is that going to be what they need in the future? I don't think it is. And certainly groups that I've worked with in this sector have said, well, actually, we've got to change this. And now a number of these organisations that are our clients for psych testing are actually specifically targeting changing the profile to be a little bit more ambitious and self-directed and a little bit less sort of security conscious, being prepared to take an appropriate risk. Obviously, you don't want it to drop below average in comparison with other sectors, but there are some things here that you would probably want in order to be more proactive, more competitive, and a bit more like commerce. So values do matter. They determine cultural fit. Now, you see, if we look at these values, power, achievement, hedonism, stimulation, they don't really appear on too many value statements, but these are values that are measurable and which can be shown to apply in the real world. Now, values determine cultural fit. If I have a certain value set and my colleagues have a different value set, I'm not going to be liked or comfortable with my colleagues. So the vast majority of value statements have nothing to do with values as they're empirically measured. And we've done this. We've looked at the value statements of organisations and we've measured the people in those organisations. And what you often find is very significant disconnects. If you're going to put people into a team, it's very valuable to measure the values profile of that team. And then you recruit people who are not too far from that group profile. So that's a scientific approach to culture match. There's also a different question, though, because if you say, all right, well, we want a different value set because our world is changing, well, it's kind of like a workforce planning challenge, isn't it? And it's a very appropriate thing to do, to say, we're going to need more of this or less of that as the years go by, so we'll start recruiting by measuring this. And that's what many organisations are doing now. They're taking this scientific approach to culture match. About 4 years ago, we tried to predict bad behaviours using personality and values. And we found that we could predict personality, we could use personality and values to predict bad behaviour. We found that combined, we could predict it with about 45% accuracy. 45%. Now, given that your average interview is accurate to the tune of about 12% and your average reference check is accurate to the tune of about 7%, 45% is massive, and that's why many organisations have found a reduction in bad behaviours through psych testing with the right tools on the way in. But what we were also able to do is we were able to look at the degree to which values predicted bad behaviours versus personality. And the answer is that we found that values predicted bad behaviours with about 17 to 18% accuracy, not nothing, and certainly better than 12 or 7, but 17% accuracy. But personality predicted bad behaviours with about 40% accuracy. So if you want to have good behaviours in your organisation, it's a good idea to screen on personality. That's crucial. But it's also not a bad idea to get people with appropriate values sets. Because if you do that, you'll end up with better behaviours. So just to summarise, MVV statements, yeah, they work, but really rarely, and certainly they're very cumbersome, tedious things to create. Remember the proximal and distal equation. If it's proximal, it's likely to work. If it's distal, it's unlikely to work. Think also about the proximal distal question in time. An MVV statement, people undertake them and they say, when they get to the end of it, they say, whoa, never again. You know, things become distal in time. In a group, if I create something now and then I go back 2-3 years later and look at it again, it's going to be distal. It's too long. The exercise I described earlier of creating a group-based behaviour protocol, that should take you only about an hour or two to create. Not an hour. It'll take you in a big group 3 hours to create. Well, what that means is you can do it once a year. And because you're doing it in a distributed fashion, you don't bring the organisation grinding to a halt to do it. They're very flexible and easy to create. So you can create specific measurable outcome statements. You do this, you're going to markedly increase the level of clarity within your organisation about what the organisation is about, what my team's about, and what my job's about. And you can develop local self-generated behaviour protocols which will make a difference. And basically, you can also measure values if you want to determine culture match within your group. That's a really valuable thing to do. And finally, all this will succeed where the MVV venture fails. So those are some of the things that you might like to consider. There is an alternative to MVV. It's shown to be an evidence-based perspective. It'll work far better. It's more flexible. It's easier to implement it. It's distributed. And if anybody wants a copy of this presentation, you can get it, both in terms of the slides and also I have recorded this, so you'll be able to get a copy of this. I often get requests where people say, I want to show this to, I don't know, my university professor, my whomever. Anyway, the long and the short of it, that's available. Thanks very much for listening today, and may the rest of your day be enlightened, engaged, and highly aligned.